Otherwise, presumably, we'd have a really powerful ethical reason for threatening everybody with death as soon and as early as we could to help them.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's special New Year's Day episode of Thoughts. Before we get into it, we just wanted to wish everyone a happy new year and to thank you all for all the support you've shown us in our first ever year as a podcast.
For today's episode, we have Professor Ben Colburn, who's joining us to talk about autonomy. We're going to discuss different conceptions of autonomy, the meaning of voluntary action, and how research in this area can inform and improve end-of-life care.
We hope you enjoy the episode. Here are some thoughts on autonomy. Ben, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
So today we're going to be speaking specifically about autonomy with respect to end-of-life care. I'm wondering if, just to provide a bit of context, you could give us a brief summary of your own conception of autonomy you prefer.
Sure. So in general, when we talk about autonomy, we talk about a value that we think it's important for people to have in their lives. People's lives go better the more autonomous they are. In general, we understand autonomy to be an ideal of self-governance. So broadly speaking, the autonomous life is one that the individual has some element of control over. Exactly what that control might be can be understood in different ways by different philosophers who have thought and written about this stuff. My favorite way of understanding it is to say that the autonomous agent decides for herself what is valuable and lives her life in accordance with that decision. So that's a life of self-authorship, we might say. That's a phrase I borrow from Joseph Raz. The autonomous agent shapes her life through successive decisions over the course of it, and in that way she is the author of the life taken as a whole.
So it makes sense for this to be in respect to someone beginning their lives. So somebody coming out of childhood and going to start their lives, to get a job, to go to university or whatever. So how does this relate to people nearing the end of their lives?
Good question, because you're quite right that when we think about autonomy, normally we think about childhood and education and the start of somebody's life. You might think that end of life is one of those times when actually it's not very easy to live a life of autonomy, but I think that that's partly a mistake. And in part, I think it's because how your life ends is very important for whether it's gone in the way that you think valuable or not, taken as a whole. Autonomy, as I described it, is a holistic value. That is to say, it's a property of a life taken globally rather than just of an individual at particular times. And to pursue the sort of self-authorship analogy that we get from Raz, if you think that a life is a little bit like a story that somebody writes, of course, the ending of the story, how it finishes, is every bit as important as how it goes earlier on when you have more capacities and more possibilities. In fact, you might think there's a distinctive kind of importance to the ending of a life that makes it particularly important for philosophers to think about how to secure autonomy at that point, even if in other respects somebody's options look pretty limited.
If I could linger on a bit, so in my very limited understanding, the discussion surrounding autonomy results in policy suggestions, probably mostly for young people, in the regard to give as many options or choices to choose how they live their lives. And I'm struggling to see if I remember anybody talking about end of life within this debate.
Yeah.
And I see how that is problematic with what you just said. So if you could explain maybe what that would practically mean for people nearing the end of their life.
Sure. I should say first that I think you're right that this is not a domain where people have thought a lot about distinctive questions of autonomy, with one exception, which is that people think a lot about autonomy in connection with one specific kind of end-of-life ethical issue, which is assisted dying or euthanasia. There's a lot of discussion about autonomy in that connection, but I think you're right that if we put that to one side and just think about the end of life as a phase in somebody's life more generally, it's a bit under-examined. And I think one of the reasons it's under-examined is precisely the emphasis that you focus on there, Alex. It's very easy, I think, to think that if you care about autonomy, you care about giving people freedom of choice. more options, concentrating on making people independent and self-sufficient, those sorts of things. Now, go back to what I said earlier. I said that autonomy in general can be understood as an ideal of self-governance or of self-control. Different people can understand what that type of self-governance means to different extents. And there are some people who think about autonomy as meaning having freedom, having lots of options, having lots of choices, being independent, not requiring help from other people. But I think, and I'm not alone in this, I think this is true of lots of contemporary thinkers about autonomy, that that's a sort of impoverished way of understanding what the autonomous life is. I think that being the author of your own life means bearing that kind of relationship of governance in collaboration with other people, recognizing that we're social beings, recognizing that we're relational beings. So I understand what autonomy requires to be kind of different, that actually relations of mutual dependence and support can be helpful for autonomy, not a problem for autonomy. Now, you asked, what does that mean in practice for end of life? Well, I think that sometimes people look at the end of life and they look at the type of dependence or incapacity that often characterizes sort of geriatric care or palliative care or just old age. And they think, oh, well, autonomy has gone out of the window here because you're no longer able to live a life of full independence. So this is just not an ethical concept that applies anymore. I think that's a mistake. And I think actually that the kinds of interdependency that can develop at end of life are things which are certainly compatible with autonomy and actually might bring out new ways of living valuable lives in our eyes. I think there can be types of projects that we can engage in at the end of life which are distinctive and can offer a new way of deciding for ourselves what's valuable in living our lives. But I think you're right, that comes as a little bit of a surprise, because the way that we tend to think about end of life is as a closing in. And what I've been trying to think about is how even at the same time as the horizons of our lives close in, because death is approaching, because we're growing old, because we're growing mentally or physically incapable in various ways, there might be other distinct kinds of lives that we can choose to lead at that point that are going to be ethically significant and are sort of ignored by ethicists who concentrate on mid-range, let's say, adult human beings as the kind of paradigm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm wondering, could you give an example? So it sounds really hopeful, like a really promising way of viewing it as well. It's got like I'm kind of seeing it as like, as some doors close, other ones open, and you might be able to kind of recalibrate your own personal subjective conception of what it is for you to live a self-authored life, as you say. But what kind of thing, is it just that? Is it that ideally people in those sorts of circumstances will be able to, with the adequate support, kind of recalibrate what really matters for them? Is it as simple as sort of losing interest in some things that you can no longer do anyway and putting more importance into things that you can now? Or is it not quite as simple as that?
It's not quite as simple as that.
I thought that might be the answer.
Although that's part of it, of course, Ross. I think that one of the things that I've been trying to do in my philosophical work, but also the work I've been doing with palliative care organizations, is exactly what you say. That is to say, trying to find ways of helping people to refocus their attention on different things that they can value, which are within the scope of their capabilities in restricted circumstances. And that's really important. There's also a danger there. There's a danger that people might be familiar with if they've thought about adaptive preference formation. So when you adapt your preferences, you kind of tailor your ideas about what's valuable and what you want based on a reaction to the fact that your walls are closing in. And in lots of cases, this is a real problem. It's a problem if somebody's ambitions become horribly restricted because they're disabled or because they live in a world characterized by structural oppression or something of that sort. But I think there's a kind of adaptation involved in old age, which is not adaptive in the bad sense, which is good from the point of view of autonomy. And it's the one that you describe. You say to people, well, look, I mean, I know you loved being an athlete when you were younger. You can't be an athlete now, but look, here are some other things that you could do instead. That, of course, is not actually about promoting autonomy in a distinctive way in old age. That's about kind of protecting a space for autonomy because it's under threat. And that's very important. But I have been thinking about the second thing as well. That's the more complicated thing. So I have also been trying to think about whether there might be distinct ways of being autonomous in old age. And I think there could be. So here's one example, which is that I think that having your death approaching makes you confront the question about whether what you value is certain things happening out there in the world, your ambitions being fulfilled, or whether what you value is having the experience of your ambitions being fulfilled. This is a sort of variant, I guess, on the familiar thought experiments that try to draw the difference between a subjective and an objective conception of well-being. Now, for most of us who don't feel as though our death is approaching, we might be mistaken about that, of course, but most of us don't feel that our death is approaching if we're kind of the age that the three of us are, for example, in our 20s and 30s. But so mostly we're not confronted with having to make this choice, because if you have ambitions and you work to have them satisfied and they're satisfied, then for the most part in real life, you get the feeling of satisfaction along with the objective fact of those ambitions being realized. But of course, as you approach death, you have to confront the question, well, what do I really value? Is what I value these things happening out there in the world, in which case I should act towards them, even though I know that it's unlikely that I'm going to see that happen? Or was what I valued having certain pleasant subjective experiences associated with it? And I think one of the lessons of valuing autonomy is that we shouldn't really make a judgment about which one of these is better or worse. I think they're just two different value sets that you can have. But what you can get, the distinctive value for autonomy that you can get in old age, is that because you're confronted with the split between these two conceptions of value, you can learn more about yourself. Self-knowledge is good for autonomy. And then you can focus on the thing that's important. And if it's the objective conception, well, then you can throw your energies in old age into establishing some sort of legacy. And you won't be there to experience it, but the thing that you value might come to pass. On the other hand, if you value the subjective thing, then perhaps you tailor your ambitions, you cease to worry too much about the future, and you focus on having the pleasurable experiences and interactions with people around you without worrying too much about the long term. And I think either of those two things in combination with the self-knowledge is something which is a distinctive kind of benefit to autonomy that somebody can have from being confronted with the fact of their impending death.
So basically what you're saying is that as we grow old, or as our death comes near, because death can come in many ways and not through old age. So as death comes nearer, the subjectiveness of our experience falls away. So our priorities in life come into focus and we rearrange them more correctly. Is that
I think that that is
correct?
very often people's experience, yes. So I presented it as a kind of neutral choice between thinking about things as being just subjectively valuable versus thinking about things as being objectively valuable. And I think that as a matter of fact, most people as they're approaching death, and by the way, I love the fact that you emphasized that not everybody who is approaching death is also in old age. That's a really important thing to hold on to that lots of people in this literature ignore, I think. But sorry, leaving that thought aside, I presented it as a choice, but I think you're right that in practice, what people report as they're approaching their death is that the subjective stuff does fall away, that they realize that actually what matters to them is not the feeling of satisfaction they get from seeing their ambitions fulfilled or experiential happiness or things like that. The things that really matter to them are the things happening out there in the world that they hope for. And that it's in one sense sad if they don't get to experience that, but it doesn't really matter for the thing that they value. That is to say, you sort of focus on legacy. And one thing we can really do to help support people in continuing to live valuable, autonomous lives as they approach death is to help them think about the way that what they do now, the exercise of their agency while they've still got it at present, can still have this ongoing normative effect even after they've died. Lots of people find that thought quite comforting, I think. But I want to say not everybody would need to. I mean, somebody could listen to what you said, Alex, and just say, no, I'm doubling down on the subjective conception. I realize that what matters to me is pleasure. What matters to me is friendship and companionship. And I mean, in some sense, we might think it's a little surprising that somebody takes that view, that they cease to care all that much about the future. But of course, it's a valid standpoint that somebody could take. And again, if we know about it, if they have thought about it and decided it, then we can arrange end-of-life care for them in a way that protects that, gives them more friendship, companionship, fun, gets rid of pain, and so on.
So we've touched upon it there a little bit, but something we're really interested in is this topic of just age, brute age, and the difference that makes. So what, if anything, has your research kind of uncovered about the differences in the way autonomy is undermined, let's say for someone in their 80s coming to the end of life and someone in their 30s who unfortunately come into the end of life?
It's a good question. The short answer is that there's been surprisingly little written about this. I think that for the most part, maybe because people are making the mistake that Alex picked out of assuming that all of these features of the end of life predicament go together, people haven't separated them out very much. So generally speaking, when philosophers write about end of life, they're talking about somebody who is approaching death and is in old age. I think that in the literature on well-being, there is an interesting debate about what the significance and badness of death is. And one of the arguments that some people make in that literature is that death is worse for a young person, all else being equal, than it is for an old person, because there's more kind of potential life that is lost if somebody dies in their 20s compared to dying in their 80s. Now, I can understand why somebody would make such an argument, but I find it a very philosophically implausible line to take myself, I have to say. I mean, for one thing, it's not as though age is the only factor to be taken into account here. There are going to be lots of individual differences that are going to make a difference to how much potential is lost anyway. And also, more boringly, you have to make counterfactual judgments about how long somebody would have lived otherwise, what they would have experienced otherwise, which I just don't see that we're in a position to make when it comes to individual lives. The best that we can do is point out that statistically you would expect your average 20-year-old to live for about sort of 57 more years, and you'd expect your average 70-year-old to live for only about 7 more years, but that seems ethically inert. And also, to go back to autonomy, one of the key things about autonomy is that it implies a sort of anti-perfectionism. That is to say, it implies that when we're creating the institutions of the state and of our medical structures, we shouldn't be making judgments on people's behalves about what is valuable. And I worry a little bit that this ageist assumption that underlies some of the well-being literature is doing that. It's making a judgment that the type of potential you have when you're in your 20s is in some sense more valuable than the type of potential you have when you're in your 80s. So I think if we're looking for a difference, we might think that it's the extra loss of potential when you're young that's the problem. But I don't think that works for the reasons that I've just given. I don't think that's the type of judgment we should be making.
If I could intercut.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your paper you sent over to us, there was a passage that you quoted from a book that I really liked. And if I could get you to quote like a line or two, just to say that also there's a difference of identity, of cumulative identity.
There is. As it happens, I have the book to hand, so let me just get it for you. Yeah, so I was going to say, although I think that well-being, the way that the literature of well-being deals with this, I think, is wrong. I still think it's true that there is something distinctive and special about old age as such. And the way that I've been trying to think about this comes actually from a piece of literature rather than a piece of philosophy. And it comes from the very end of À la recherche du temps perdu, Marcel Proust's great novel. So I guess I should, maybe we should have a spoiler warning or something here, because there may be people who want to read it who don't want the last page read out for them. But assuming that we can deal with that, I mean, here's the passage that excited me. I'll read it out to you. I felt, as I say, a sensation of weariness and almost of terror at the thought that all this length of time had not only without interruption been lived, experienced, secreted by me, that it was my life, was in fact me, but also that I was compelled so long as I was alive to keep it attached to me, that it supported me, and that, perched on its giddy summit, I could not myself make a movement without displacing it. A feeling of vertigo seized me as I looked down beneath me, yet within me, as though from a height, which was my own height of many leagues, at the long series of the years. Now, what's Proust saying there? Well, Proust's narrator is reflecting on the fact that he's become old. And he comes up with this beautiful metaphor of almost finding himself suddenly on stilts, where beneath him, almost without him realizing it, he's accumulated this great structure over the course of his life, which is, it's not separate from him. That structure is his life. It's part of his identity. But it's this thing which is experienced as having great height and great weight and provoking vertigo and dizziness. Now, those three ingredients, I think, are really important. I think that the great height is a way of capturing the fact that when you've lived for a long time, there's just you have a greater ability to see things, to remember things. Your vision extends further, both in the sense that you have more memory of things that has happened to you looking back, and also perhaps that you have greater wisdom, that you have greater experience that allows you to understand the scope of the world better, which is good. But the problem is that this comes at a cost, which is that you've accumulated life, you've accumulated time, and this is experienced by him as something wearying and something that induces a kind of vertigo. And I think that he's onto something philosophically important there. I think the process of living creates a kind of burden for somebody over time, which it's quite difficult to account for, really. But I suppose I tend to think of it as the following, that as you live your life, one of the things that you do that promotes your autonomy is that you become responsible for more and more things. That is to say, you stand in relations to events that happen in the world or as part of your life, or to other people, in a way which creates these normative connections between you and those things. When you successfully complete your degree, you stand suddenly in this relationship of responsibility towards this great achievement that you've managed to pull through. When you build a house, you stand in that relation to that collection of bricks and mortar and so on. So that's all to the good for autonomy, because being able to create those relationships of responsibility is what authoring your life consists in, I think. But I think it also creates a burden, because none of those decisions that create these relationships are going to be ones which come costlessly. There's always going to be a cost to every decision you make about how to live your life. There's going to be an element of regret, so that's subjective cost. There are going to be things that we do which we think are wrong and where we bear some kind of burden, which isn't just subjective, where we've made a choice, the result of which is that we owe a duty to somebody else, or that we merit punishment, or we owe compensation or something of that sort. The process of living a life creates this sort of normative baggage, I think, in both a subjective and in an objective sense, which is inextricably bound up with the process of creating connections of responsibility. That's what self-authorship is all about. And I think that what Proust is talking about at the end of his novel is the sudden realization that at the end of your life, the weight of these normative connections that you've created can be cripplingly heavy, because it's just so significant. There's a whole life that you have created, a whole lifetime of choices to do this rather than that, a whole lifetime of compromises where in imperfect circumstances you've had to do morally imperfect things. And I think that that is a distinct predicament for autonomy at end of life, which is separate completely from questions about impending death, separate from questions about mental incapacity and physical incapacity, separate from questions about pain and suffering, all these other things that we might focus on. Because I think that the distinct predicament that comes from suddenly finding your life too heavy for you to keep carrying it is something which is interesting to reflect upon, and is a distinctive kind of problem. How we support people to continue authoring their lives in that situation is really tricky. Anyway, it's early days, this line of thought. I don't know whether I think this completely works. My main collaborator on End of Life Matters, that's my colleague Jennifer Corns, thinks that I'm mistaken in believing there's this distinct dimension to old age. She thinks that it's a beautiful piece of literature, but nothing more than that, philosophically speaking. I think that everything ethically problematic can be captured by the other ingredients that I've talked about: death, suffering and pain, incapacity. But I think Proust's onto something philosophical, and it's one of the things I'm trying to think through at the moment.
We're looking forward to hearing the end of that thought whenever that's done. So you mentioned 4 dimensions to what may be problematic when going into old age and coming near to death. Would you mind expanding on those and maybe connecting them to how they might be problematic for self-authorship, and
Sure.
maybe what are the solutions to those problems?
Of course I can. Well, we've talked a bit about old age as such already. This is the idea that there's something distinctively problematic for autonomy connected with the fact of having lived a long time. So that's a problem that faces somebody who is approaching death in old age, but perhaps not somebody who's approaching death much earlier. And it's independent of these other dimensions. How we help people with that, I don't know. Maybe we get them to read Proust. Proust helps me with this. But more generally, I think that I wonder whether some of the tools of therapy and of self-understanding are the best things to help people with at this point. That maybe part of the burden comes from a sort of cognitive dissonance that pushes people into a sort of psychological disintegration. And so therapeutic help that can help people integrate their experiences and reconcile themselves to the choices they've made might help with that dimension. Other dimensions that I think we need to pay attention to, well, there's the fact of approaching death. And again, actually, we've talked a little bit about that too, of course, haven't we? Obviously, one thing we can't do is eliminate death. We might be able to postpone it, but it's not always clear that postponing death is the best way to support a person at end of life, because there might be other costs. They might be suffering from great pain, for example, in which case postponing death is not a good thing to do, I think. But of course, we can help somebody with the distinctive dangers of approaching death for autonomy by getting them to reflect on some of those questions that we talked about the contrast between subjective and objective ways of thinking about what's valuable in your life, and maybe encouraging somebody to see that there might be things that they can focus on which create a legacy for them beyond their death, which means that they can continue exerting that control which is characteristic of autonomy beyond the point they might otherwise have thought. So one way you can help deal with the challenge that death might just act as a guillotine for meaningfulness in your life is to help somebody think about what matters beyond that. Now, we haven't talked about the other two dimensions at all. So one of those dimensions is pain and suffering. So negative affect, we might say, negative experiences that you might have, or impairment of agency is the way that I know Jennifer is thinking about suffering, for example, your agency being impaired in various ways in a way that captures an intuitive conception of suffering. Now, let's just focus on the experiential elements of that, the subjective elements of that. That poses a problem for autonomy, for one thing, because people on the whole don't want to suffer pain. They don't want to have negative experiences. So if somebody is having those experiences, then that's bad for their autonomy. And the way that we might try to deal with that is to have a much more intelligent and generous regime of pain management. I think very often at end of life, medical effort goes into trying to cure diseases and cure conditions for a very long time. And people shift into thinking about pain management only at the very end of that process. So palliative care is the name given to care which is aiming primarily at alleviating pain and suffering. But for the most part, palliative care only kicks in when the doctors have given up on trying to save your life or cure the disease you have. I think that perhaps what we need is much more of a continuum where we attend to trying to deal with pain and giving people well, hopefully getting rid of pain, but at least giving people control over pain at a much earlier stage. And then the other dimension that I distinguish is incapacity. By incapacity, I guess I mean there being things that you previously could do, abilities or capacities that you have, which you don't on account of whatever it is that explains your impending death. That of course could be mental, so people suffer from degenerative mental conditions like dementia, for example, memory loss, or other kinds of mental illness. You have people suffering from depression, for example, as they approach their death. And mental incapacity of that sort can attack autonomy both by getting rid of our capacity to think about what's valuable and to decide for ourselves, but also by getting rid of some of the key tools that we need to use to be able to make our lives go that way. Physical incapacity can do the same sort of thing. If you suffer from physical disability or frailty or increasing fatigue or stuff of that sort, then again, that might not be so bad from the point of view of making it hard for you to decide what's valuable. It doesn't necessarily fog up your ability to be an agent in that sense, but it makes it much harder to affect your agency in the world, to achieve the things that you want. And again, if we recognize that, then there are certain things we can do to provide a kind of scaffolding for people. So, for example, mobility accommodations, making buildings and public spaces easier for people with mobility restrictions to travel around. There are lots of reasons we might want to do that. One of the reasons we might want to do that is precisely that it makes it easier for people with physical incapacities to continue doing a wide range of the sorts of things that they like at end of life. And that's good for autonomy. Now, I mean, that's a real whistle-stop tour there, Alex. There are quite a lot of different things that one could say. But I think it shows that once you realize that the end-of-life predicament has these different dimensions, and that they affect autonomy in different ways that will have a different pattern for different people, then there are quite a lot of different sorts of things that we might want to do. And none of them is particularly unfamiliar, I think. I mean, it's not like the practical measures that I'm describing are things that I've invented out of the blue, plainly not. I mean, ramps for people in wheelchairs in city centres is not a new thing that I've invented. But seeing that they all fit together in this constellation, I think, allows us to see that supporting people at end of life is actually something that we already have a lot of the tools to do. It's just that we haven't seen how they fit together properly, because we haven't recognized the interaction between the core ideal of autonomy on the one hand and this multidimensional predicament that people face at end of life on the other hand.
Great. So for our kind of closing sections, I'm wondering if we can pivot to the slightly more explicitly practical implications of this work. So you've argued in a separate paper that we argued for having the option of assisted suicide from some of the considerations we've been speaking about before. But what I find really interesting about your argument is that you argue from the perspective of someone who doesn't necessarily want to take that option. Is that right? Could you tell us a little bit about that argument?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is one important dimension that we need to attend to, or one important thing that we need to do to support autonomy. It's not the only one. That is to say, offering people the legal right to assisted dying is not the only thing that we should do, and offering it by itself would not be enough really to support people's autonomy properly. But I think it is really important for the reasons that you said, Ross. So let me summarize the argument briefly. Most people, when they think about the relationship between autonomy and proposals to legalize assisted dying, focus on the thought that, well, if you want to die, then your autonomy is being restricted if you're not allowed to die. So you should be allowed to die. Now, I think that's a pretty good argument. It needs to be a bit more complicated than that, but I think it's basically right. But of course, from the point of view of practice, it's speaking to what we hope is on the whole quite a small constituency, that is to say people who want at this moment to die. The argument that I've offered shows that actually there's a reason that speaks to all of us, even people who don't want to die. I don't currently want to die, but it's in my interests, it's in the interests of my autonomy for me to have the legal right to die, for the following reason, which is that having that option is good for me because it increases my capacity to make voluntary choices about what I do. And on the whole, I think that having more choices that you can make voluntarily is good for your autonomy. And it means, therefore, that having that option on the table changes the character of the decisions I make about other things, because I'm not compelled into continuing to live by dint of not having the option of an assisted death if I want it. I was got into thinking about this by a talk I saw by this really inspiring Times journalist, a woman called Melanie Reid. Melanie Reid is a very distinguished journalist, and about 10 years ago, I think, maybe a little longer now, she had a terrible horse riding accident that left her very substantially disabled. She's almost quadriplegic, which means that she's paralyzed below the neck, except that she has a small amount of movement in a couple of the fingers of one of her hands, I think. But that's it. Otherwise, she's completely immobile. And she has written a lot of interesting things about her experience. She's well worth looking out for. And there was a talk that I saw her give, which echoed some things she'd written, where she talked about why she supports the option of assisted dying. And it's very interesting because she doesn't currently want to die. She finds her life very difficult, but she gets lots of value out of it. And she says that every morning she wakes up and she thinks about dying. She thinks about whether she wants to go on living. And she says, and I quote, "Every morning I choose fiercely to live." But of course, she chooses to live because she has the option of dying. She's a wealthy and educated person who has the money to be able to go to the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland. So for her, there is this option of an assisted death if she wants it. For lots of people, of course, that isn't an option because most of us don't have the money to be able to do that. And she thinks that having the option of assisted dying is really important for making her life go better, even though that's not the option that she wants to take, because her choice to go on living in the presence of that option is affirmative. It's something which she is actively choosing to do and represents her exercising this element of control, of authoring her life. So because she has this alternative, even though she doesn't want to take it, she continues to be the author of her life by choosing to live. Whereas I think that absent that option, her continuing to live would not be an expression of her self-authorship. It would represent her being trapped. And that's the situation that I think a lot of people at end of life are in. Now, it may be that we don't currently want to die, but recognizing that having the option improves our capacity for being able to author our lives in all of the other things that we do, I think is a really powerful new argument that can be harnessed in favor of this kind of legal reform. And it's been interesting to present that argument, for example, in the Scottish Parliament, and to talk with people who are hoping to draft a new white paper to try and legalise assisted dying in Scotland. That does seem to be a distinctive way of arguing for it that adds something new to public discussion in this area and might speak to a wider constituency than the old arguments that we're all familiar with from our first year philosophy courses.
Before Ross asks his very interesting question, could you define what voluntariness means concerning choices?
Absolutely. So voluntariness, I think, is a matter of the reasons for which you act. So I think about voluntariness in a way that's influenced by the philosopher Serena Olseretti. She's a professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And she defines voluntariness this way. An action is non-voluntary when somebody performs it because there are no acceptable alternatives, and an action is voluntary when it's not non-voluntary. So the classic example of a non-voluntary action is a coerced action. Suppose that I'm a highwayman and I point a gun at your head and I say, your money or your life. What I'm basically doing there is I'm saying, look, I've got a gun to your head and I have made it so that any alternative to you doing what I want you to do, namely giving me your money, is going to involve you getting a bullet to the head. That's unacceptable. So there's a sense in which you choose to give your money to me in that situation. I haven't physically compelled you. I haven't made it literally impossible for you to say no. But what I've done is I've created a situation where I know that you're going to do what I want you to do because all of the alternatives are unacceptable. Now, that's a paradigm example of a non-voluntary choice. And voluntariness is the opposite of that. So voluntary choice happens when you're not compelled into picking the options you do just to avoid something really unpleasant on the other options that you might have picked. So that's the thought. In the case of end of life, your choice to go on living is non-voluntary if you don't have any alternatives that you could pick voluntarily. Whereas if there is an alternative, so if there's an option of a painless and efficient death that you could pick instead, then that represents an acceptable alternative, which means that you can then just make the choice. You can go on living if you want, or you can die if you want, but you don't have this element of non-voluntariness that comes about as a result of being compelled into picking what you do because there's nothing else that's acceptable to you.
Yeah, so I find this fascinating. This leads directly into my question I wanted to ask, which is something you touched upon in the paper, and I find it difficult to sum up, but I'm going to try. It's extremely important on your view of autonomy that you have a range of acceptable options. In order that you autonomously choose to go for one option, it kind of needs to be the case that you had other acceptable options available. Is that right so far?
I'm going to be really irritating here, Ross.
Okay, good.
The answer is no, not strictly speaking. This is where the gap between moral philosophy and political philosophy becomes really clear. So the position that I do hold, which is very close to what you just said, is that the state aiming to promote autonomy has to provide a range of options that it hopes are acceptable, because that is by far the best way that we can ensure that somebody is able to find an option that works for them, given what they care about, and which they can pursue happily and in a way that leads to them having an autonomous life. So that's true. From the point of view of politics, we have to secure the condition that you just described. That's absolutely correct. However, that's not because, strictly speaking, somebody can't live an autonomous life in the absence of those alternatives. That's now a question within moral philosophy rather than political philosophy. But here's why. The crucial thing is being able to shape your life through successive voluntary choices. And voluntariness is a matter of the reason that you make the decisions that you do. So somebody acts non-voluntarily when they choose to do something because there are no acceptable alternatives. But notice that it's possible for somebody to choose to do a certain thing, but the reason for that not to be that there are no acceptable alternatives, even if, as a matter of fact, there aren't any acceptable alternatives. So here's an example from Olseretti's work. Olseretti talks about a character she calls Wendy, who lives in a wired city. What is the wired city? Well, this is a city which has an electric fence around the perimeter, which would kill anybody who tries to leave it. So nobody who lives in this city has the option of going. It's unacceptable. They'll just burn, they'll frizzle off to death on the electric fence. However, the city is a great place, and it has all of the things that Wendy wants in a place that she lives. So Wendy chooses not to leave the city. She chooses to live her life there. Is her choice non-voluntary? Well, it's true of Wendy that she has no acceptable alternatives, because any choice except staying in the city involves her dying on the electric fence. However, that's not the reason that Wendy acts as she does. She acts as she does, she stays in the city because she loves the cinemas and the art galleries, and she pursues her career as a scientist, let's say, in the excellent labs in the city. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means, I think, that in very special cases, somebody could live an autonomous life, even in the absence of acceptable alternatives, because the things that they choose to do happen to match up with their desires and their preferences so perfectly that the absence of alternatives doesn't actually matter to them. But of course, and this takes us back to politics, that would be a really dangerous thing for us to rely on in our politics, because of course being able to secure the conditions of autonomy for such a person would require such a precise level of knowledge about exactly what her desires are, exactly what her ambitions are. It requires such surveillance of making sure that if her preferences change, we give her more avenues to secure her autonomy, that practically speaking it would be impossible. And indeed would be quite dangerous, I think, to rely on the thought that somebody's autonomy could flourish in the absence of alternative options as something in our politics. So the funny thing is that as a political philosopher, I say, yes, absolutely, we have to secure a range of acceptable alternatives for people. But the reason for that is not because, conceptually speaking, you have to have those alternatives to be autonomous. It's because necessarily the things that we must do in politics fall apart slightly from the sorts of things that we think about as moral philosophers in the abstract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, no, so that makes much more sense, and that's really clear. I'm still wondering, though, about practically and politically putting the option of assisted suicide on the table, whether this question of whether or not one can, by your own account, autonomously choose that option. So the issue comes with thinking about someone who would see that as a live option and will benefit in all the ways you've described from having that just as an option, whether or not they choose it. But there is something that seems almost paradoxical about it, which is that it just doesn't seem likely, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it doesn't seem like it's going to happen very often, whereby someone chooses that option when they really truly deem the other options available to them acceptable. In other words, it seems inherently a last-ditch option.
That's a very wise thing to say, Ross. And of course, I agree with you to a large extent. There is something paradoxical about this. And we know from the social scientific research that the explanation for people wanting to die is very often that they don't see any acceptable alternative to it. They die because they want to avoid pain that they can't escape, because they don't want to suffer from complete dependency on other people, because they don't want their loved ones to suffer. That all sounds exactly like non-voluntary choice, doesn't it? It sounds like they're picking this option because all of the alternatives are unacceptable to them. In which case, so the thought might go, how can having that option on the table help promote their autonomy? I think there are two things to say about that. I mean, the first thing to say is that even if that's right, it doesn't mean that there's an autonomy-based reason for keeping the option away from people. I mean, maybe the pessimistic thing to say is just, well, in some circumstances, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, in the sense that your life might reach a point where actually you have no choices that you can face voluntarily. Well, under those circumstances, there's at least no autonomy-based reason to deny people the thing that imperfectly they end up choosing in that situation. But I think that this takes us back to something that I was sort of complaining about earlier, which is that we shouldn't think about proposals to legalize assisted dying in isolation from other measures that we take. Because euthanasia is such a familiar topic within applied ethics, philosophers tend to write about the rights and wrongs of assisted dying as though it's just a single proposal that's on the table and we consider it in the absence of any connections with other things we might do. But of course, actually, one of the things that I'm discovering is that the landscape of end-of-life ethics is a lot more interesting and complicated and interconnected than that. And what that means, I think, is that we have a powerful autonomy-based reason to allow assisted dying, but it's a reason that goes along with improving the quality of geriatric and palliative care in a way that, as far as possible, gives people acceptable alternatives to dying as well. So, for example, if the reason that somebody wants to die is because they fear unmanageable pain otherwise, well, in lots of cases, we can do things to mitigate that. There are lots of ways that we could pump research into better pain science, for example, and try to find ways of alleviating those terrible experiences. But also, we can recognize that one of the reasons that people find the prospect of endless pain unacceptable is because pain is tied up with a tremendous fear of loss of control. Part of, I think, what's unpleasant about pain is the effect it has on your agency, the expectation of fear that comes along with it, and the sense that you're losing control. And there are ways in which pain management can help give somebody control, even if it can't completely get rid of the negative experiences that somebody is having. I feel like a little bit of a fraud talking to you about this, because we're very lucky in Glasgow that we have three of the best philosophers working on the theory of pain in the world in the department. Michael Brady, David Bain, and Jennifer Corns are all much more expert at this than I am. But I think that looking at it from the patient testimony point of view, like I am, it's clear that that lack of control in respect of your pain is one of the main things that people report as being unacceptable to them, and we can mitigate that. So I think you're right, Ross, that just giving people the option of assisted dying by itself is, well, probably something we should do, but we shouldn't expect people's autonomy automatically to be much improved by that by itself. But if we think about these other creative things we can do with palliative care at the same time, then actually putting these things together, you get quite a powerful package. And you get something which really does help to deal with all of these different dimensions that we distinguished earlier on in our conversation, because you end up with something that offers options no matter what the particular ambitions and predicament that somebody finds themselves in are.
That makes total sense. Yeah, that's amazing work. Amazing, it really is.
We should say thank you for joining us. It was great fun.
Wonderful. Yes, I've had a lot of fun, guys. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks for taking so much time with us, Ben. We really appreciate it.
You're most welcome.